I want to tell you about a night I've never really talked about. Not to my husband, not to my own daughter, not to anyone in all these years. And I worked at that palace for 19 of them, so believe me, I had stories. Most of them I kept because that was the job. You see things in a place like Calderwood. You learn to look at the floor. But this one stayed with me for a different reason. It stayed because I watched a woman fall apart in a hallway that smelled of beeswax and old roses, and I watched a man catch her before she hit the ground. And I've never been able to forget the sound she made. It wasn't loud. That's the thing people always get wrong when they imagine these moments. They think grief is loud. It isn't. The worst of it is almost silent. Let me start from the beginning, or close to it. My name is Wren. That's not the name I was born with, but it's the one everyone at the palace called me, because when I first started I was small and quick, and apparently I had a habit of darting into rooms before anyone knew I was coming. The head housekeeper, a terrifying woman named Mrs. Halloway, gave me the name on my second day. It stuck. By the end I'd half forgotten I'd ever been anything else. I came to Calderwood Palace when I was 22. I'd grown up in a town 3 hours north, the kind of place where nothing happens and everyone knows it. My mother used to say the most exciting thing that ever came through was the weather. So when I got the letter saying I'd been taken on as a junior dresser, that's a fancy word for someone who helps lay out clothes, mend hems, and stand very still in corners, I cried for an hour. My father drove me down himself. He wore his good coat. He didn't say much, but when he dropped me at the staff entrance, he held my shoulders and said, "You behave yourself, Wren. These are important people." As if I didn't know. Calderwood, if you've never seen it, sits at the end of a long gravel drive lined with lime trees. It's the official residence of the royal family of Aldermere, which, I should say, is a small kingdom, not one of the big famous ones, but old. Very old. The kind of place where the stones have seen more than any of us ever will. There's a clock tower that chimes every quarter hour, and a fountain in the east courtyard with a cracked stone fish that's been spitting water since before my grandmother was born. The palace itself is enormous and cold and beautiful, and in 19 years I never stopped feeling like a guest in it. You don't get used to ceilings that high. You just learn to stop looking up. The family, in those days, was made up of a few people you'd need to know about for this story. There was the king, old King Aldrich, a heavy, slow-moving man with kind eyes and bad knees, who by the time of this story was mostly tired. He'd ruled a long time. You could see it on him. He spent his afternoons in the library and his evenings going to bed early, and the running of things had quietly passed, bit by bit, to the next generation. There was his eldest son, Crown Prince Henrik, and there was Henrik's wife. Her name was Seraphine, but everyone called her Sira. I need to tell you about Sira, because if you don't understand who she was, none of the rest of this will land the way it should. When I first arrived, Sira had been married into the family for about 4 years. She wasn't born royal. She came from a respectable enough family. Her father owned a shipping company down by the coast, decent money but no title, no castles, nothing. And the country, when Henrik married her, was split right down the middle about it. Half the people thought it was romantic. A future king marrying a girl from a coastal town, marrying for love. The other half thought it was an embarrassment. That she wasn't good enough. That the bloodline mattered more than the heart. I'll let you guess which half the newspapers belonged to. Sira carried all of that on her shoulders every single day, and here's the thing, she carried it gracefully. I don't say that lightly. I watched her up close for years, closer than almost anyone, because part of my job came to be helping with her wardrobe, and there's no faking it when someone is being dressed at 6 in the morning before a state event. You see them with no armor on. You see who they really are. And Sira, underneath it all, was just a kind person trying very hard. She learned everyone's names, not just the senior staff, everyone, the boy who polished the silver, the woman who did the laundry, my own name the first week I met her, even though I was nobody. She remembered that my father had driven me down. Months later she asked me how he was. I nearly dropped a hairpin. She wasn't perfect. She had a temper buried somewhere deep, though I only saw it slip out twice in all those years, and both times she apologized after. She got anxious before big events. Her hands would shake and she'd press them flat against her skirt to make it stop. She bit the inside of her cheek when she was nervous. Little human things. Things the public never saw because the public only ever saw the photographs, the perfect woman in the perfect dress, smiling, always smiling. Nobody asked what it cost her to smile like that. Henrik loved her. That part was real, and I'll stake my life on it. I saw the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching, and you can't fake that either. He was a serious man, Henrik, reserved. The papers called him cold, but they had it wrong. He wasn't cold, he was careful. He'd grown up in front of cameras, and he'd learned young that the way to survive it was to give nothing away. But with Sira in private, he softened. I once saw him reach over at a dinner and brush a crumb off her cheek with his thumb, this tiny gesture, and she laughed. And for a second they weren't a prince and princess at all. They were just two people who liked each other. So that was the good part of the picture. Now I have to tell you about the other part, about the woman who broke her. Her name was Margaret. She was the king's second wife. His first wife, Henrik's mother, had died when Henrik was a young man, long before my time. By all accounts, the country had adored her. And then, a few years later, the king married Margaret. Now, I want to be fair. I want to tell this honestly because it would be easy to make her into a cartoon, and people aren't cartoons. Margaret had a hard road of her own. She married into a family that compared her to a dead woman every single day, and the public never warmed to her the way they'd warmed to the first queen. There were probably reasons she was the way she was. There usually are. But knowing the reasons doesn't change the damage. Margaret was the kind of woman who could ruin your whole day with one sentence and a smile. She never raised her voice. She never had to. She had this gift, and it was a gift, a dark one, for finding the exact soft spot in a person and pressing on it gently while looking like she was being perfectly pleasant. If you complained about it afterward, you'd sound mad. She only said your dress was lovely. Yes, but you weren't there. You didn't hear the way she said lovely, like she was holding it with two fingers, like it smelled of something. And from the day Sira arrived, Margaret decided she did not like her. I don't fully know why. Maybe it was as simple as this. The country was learning to love Sira, the way they'd loved Henrik's mother, the way they'd never loved Margaret. And maybe watching that day after day was a kind of slow poison. Maybe she saw in this young, warm, common-born girl everything the public had decided she herself would never be. Jealousy is an ugly thing, and it doesn't always know its own face in the mirror. Whatever the reason, Margaret spent years chipping away at Sira. Quietly, patiently, a comment here, a look there, never anything you could point to. Oh, you're wearing that tonight, how brave. Don't worry, dear, nobody expects you to know these things. You weren't raised to them. The first queen used to do it differently, but then she had a certain ease about her, you'll learn. Drip, drip, drip. And Sira, being who she was, took it. She'd press her hands flat against her skirt, and she'd smile, and she'd say, "Thank you, ma'am," and she'd carry it, year after year. Because what else could she do? You don't get to fight with the king's wife. You don't get to slam a door in a palace. The walls have ears, and the ears have newspapers, and so you swallow it, and you swallow it, and you go on smiling. I used to want to say something. God, I wanted to. There were nights I'd be brushing out Sira's hair after some dinner where I'd watched Margaret needle her across the table for 2 hours, and I'd see Sira's jaw was tight, her eyes too bright, and I'd want to say you don't have to take that. But I was a dresser. I was furniture with hands, so I'd just brush her hair very gently, slower than I needed to, and sometimes she'd catch my eye in the mirror and give me this small, tired smile, like she knew. Like the gentleness was a language we both understood. That was the world. That was the weather inside Calderwood, year after year. And then came the night of the founding gala. I should explain what the founding gala was, because it matters. Once a year in the early spring, Aldermere celebrates its founding, the day the kingdom became a kingdom hundreds of years ago. It's the biggest night on the royal calendar. Bigger than birthdays, bigger than holidays. The whole palace turns itself inside out for it. For 2 weeks beforehand, nobody sleeps. There are flowers being shipped in by the truckload. The chandeliers come down to be cleaned, every single crystal, by hand. The great ballroom gets polished until you could shave in the floor. And the family appears, all of them, together, in front of the entire country and half the world's cameras besides. It's the one night they have to stand on the balcony, shoulder to shoulder, and be the perfect family that everyone needs them to be. So you can imagine the pressure. That year the gala fell in late March. I remember because the lime trees on the drive hadn't leafed out yet, and the weather couldn't make up its mind, sunshine in the morning, then a hard cold rain by afternoon, the kind that comes down in sheets and rattles the old windows. By evening it had settled into a steady, miserable drizzle, the courtyard lamps haloed in mist, the gravel drive gone to dark wet stone. Inside, though, it was all warmth and light and noise. 300 guests, ambassadors, ministers, dukes, the lot, an orchestra in the gallery. The smell of the whole place, and I'll never forget this, it's burned into me, was beeswax from the polished floors and the heavy sweet smell of all those roses they'd brought in, white and cream and pale gold, banked up against every wall. Beeswax and roses. To this day, if I smell those two things together, my stomach drops. My job that night was simple. I was stationed in the corridor that ran behind the ballroom, the family's private corridor, where they could slip out of the public eye if they needed a moment. My orders were to wait there with a small kit, needle, thread, pins, a soft cloth, a tiny bottle of something to dab on stains. If anyone tore a hem or split a seam or spilled wine on themselves, I was to fix it fast and send them back in before anyone noticed they'd gone. That was the whole job. Stand in the corridor, be ready, be invisible. I'd done it a dozen times before. It's mostly waiting. You stand there in the half-dark with your little kit, and you listen to the muffled music through the wall and you watch the door. I remember Sira that night looked beautiful. I'm not just saying that. I'd helped dress her earlier up in her rooms, and the gown she wore was a deep midnight blue, almost the color the sky goes just after the sun's gone but before the dark comes in properly. It suited her. It made her look like she belonged, which I think was the point. She'd chosen it carefully, I knew, because she chose everything carefully when Margaret would be watching. Armor. It was all armor. When I'd finished pinning the last fold and stepped back, she'd looked at herself in the long mirror for a moment, very still, and then she'd said, quietly, almost to herself, "Do I look all right, Wren?" And I'd said, "You look like a queen, ma'am." She'd laughed a real laugh, short and surprised. "Don't let Margaret hear you say that," she'd said. "She'd have my head." It was a joke. We both treated it like a joke. I've thought about that 1,000 times since. The gala went on for hours. Through the wall I could hear it ebb and flow, the orchestra, the swell of applause when the king made his entrance, the long drone of the speeches, the laughter rising and falling like a tide. I waited in my corridor. I shifted my weight from foot to foot. My shoes were pinching. I remember being bored, if I'm honest. That's the part nobody tells you about being near important events. Most of it is standing around with sore feet, waiting for something to need fixing. A few people came and went. A duchess with a loose button which I fixed in 30 seconds. A young equerry who'd torn his sleeve and was mortified about it. The king himself shuffled past once on the arm of an aide, looking gray and exhausted, on his way to sit down somewhere quiet for 10 minutes. He nodded at me. He always nodded at the staff, the old king. Small kindness. I curtsied and he was gone. The clock tower chimed 11. And then, maybe 20 minutes after that, the private door at the far end of the corridor opened, and Sira came through it. I knew straight away that something was wrong. She wasn't walking right. Sira moved beautifully, always gliding, the papers liked to say, and for once they weren't wrong. But the woman who came through that door wasn't gliding. She was walking fast and stiff, The way you walk when you're holding yourself together by sheer force, when every muscle is clenched against something. Her chin was up. Her shoulders were back. From the front, from across a ballroom, she'd have looked composed. But I wasn't across a ballroom. I was 10 feet away in the half-dark, and I could see her hands. Her hands were shaking. Badly. She had them pressed flat against the midnight blue silk of her skirt, pressing hard, the way she did, trying to make them stop, and they wouldn't stop. She didn't see me at first. She came a few steps down the corridor, and then she stopped, just stopped dead, and put one hand out against the wall like she suddenly couldn't hold her own weight. Her head dropped, and I heard her take a breath, this long, shuddering pull of air, the kind you take when you've been holding it for far, far too long. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct said, be invisible, stay back, this isn't yours to see. But I was right there. I couldn't exactly vanish. So I said very quietly, ma'am. She startled, turned, and when she saw it was me, just Wren with her little sewing kit, something in her face came undone. I think because it was safe. I think because in all that palace, in all that crowd of 300 people who'd come to watch the royal family be perfect, I was one of the few who'd never wanted anything from her. I'd only ever brushed her hair and pinned her hems and told her she looked like a queen. Wren, she said, and her voice cracked right down the middle on the one word. Ma'am, what's happened? Are you hurt? I was already moving toward her, looking for the tear, the spill, the thing I was meant to fix, because surely it was something I could fix. That was my whole purpose. There's a torn seam. Show me the torn seam and I'll mend it. But there was no torn seam. I'm fine, she said. I'm fine, I needed a moment. I needed to. She stopped. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Her eyes were enormous and wet and shining in the dim corridor light, and she was blinking fast, fighting it, fighting so hard, because a princess does not cry, not tonight, not with 300 guests and 100 cameras on the other side of that wall. I'm fine, she said a third time, and that was when I knew she was anything but. I should tell you what had happened in that ballroom. I didn't know it yet, standing there in the corridor. I'd only pieced it together later, from what Sira told me that night and what I gathered after. But I'll tell you now, so you understand what she was carrying when she came through that door. It had been Margaret. Of course it had been Margaret. There'd been a moment earlier with the cameras, a family photograph, the whole point of the evening, all of them lined up, the king in the center. And in the shuffle of getting everyone into position, an aide had gestured Sira toward a spot near the front, near the king. A place of honor, and the cameras had been right there. And Margaret, smiling her smile, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the people who mattered but soft enough to deny later, had said something to her. I'll save the exact words, because that's the moment everything turned, and you deserve to hear it properly. The way Sira told it to me, in that corridor, with her hands shaking and the rain on the windows and the orchestra playing on, behind the wall. But I'll tell you this much now. Whatever Margaret said, it was the cruelest thing anyone had said to her in 19 years. And it was the night that everything finally broke, so there we were, the two of us in that corridor. Me with my little kit of needles and pins, useless, because there was nothing to mend. And Sira with her back half against the wall and her hands shaking and her eyes too bright, telling me for the third time that she was fine. I didn't believe her, but I didn't push. You don't push someone like that. You wait. My mother taught me that years before I ever set foot in a palace. When a person is full to the brim, she said, you don't go reaching in. You just hold the cup steady and let them spill it when they're ready. So I held the cup steady. I said, why don't you sit down a moment, ma'am? There's no one back here, just me. There was a little bench against the wall, an old wooden thing with a faded cushion, the kind of furniture they keep in the back corridors where the guests never go. She looked at it. And then, like the strings holding her up had been cut, she sat. Hard. The midnight blue skirt pooled around her. She put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands, and for a long moment she just breathed. The orchestra played on through the wall. something slow, with a lot of strings in it. I remember thinking it was a cruel thing for music to be so pretty right then. "Can I get you some water, ma'am?" I asked. She shook her head without looking up. So I waited. The clock tower chimed the half-hour, 11:30. The rain kept on against the windows, soft and steady. And after a while, still with her face in her hands, she started to talk. Not to me exactly. More like she was talking to the floor and I just happened to be there to hear it. "Do you know what she said to me?" Sierra asked. I didn't answer, because I knew the question wasn't really for me. "There was the photograph," she said. "The family photograph. You know, the one they line us all up, the whole family, every year, and it matters. It's the picture that goes everywhere. The one the whole country sees the next morning. The one that's supposed to say, 'Here we are, strong, together.'" She laughed, but there was nothing good in it. "Strong and together, God." She lifted her head finally. Her makeup had held barely, but her eyes were red-rimmed and her mouth was trembling, and she looked, in that moment, about 10 years younger than she was. She looked like a girl, a frightened girl in a beautiful dress. "The aide put me near the front," she went on. "Near His Majesty. I didn't ask for it. I never ask for it, you know. I never push myself forward. I'm always at the edges. I know my place." Her voice climbed and she caught it, dragged it back down. "But the aide put me there, and the cameras were right there. And Margaret." She stopped. Margaret leaned over, she said, close, like she was telling me something kind. She was smiling, you know, the smile. I knew the smile. "And she said," Sierra's breath hitched. She pressed her lips together, and then she said it flat, like she was reading words off a page she hated. She said, "Don't get comfortable up there, dear. You're standing where a real queen used to stand. Everyone in this room knows it. The cameras know it. The only person who seems to have forgotten is you." The corridor went very quiet. And then she said, and here Sierra's voice finally cracked all the way through. She said, "Henrik married down, and the whole country has had to live with it. The kindest thing you could do for this family is learn to take up less space." I'm not going to pretend I knew the right thing to say. I didn't. I was a dresser. I'd left school at 16. I didn't have words for a moment like that. So I just sat down next to her on the bench, which I absolutely was not supposed to do. You don't sit beside a princess. But I did it anyway, because she was a person who was hurting and I was a person who was there. And in that corridor, in that moment, the rules felt like the smallest thing in the world. She didn't tell me to get up. She didn't even seem to notice. She'd gone somewhere far away inside herself. "The thing is," she said very softly, "the thing is, I could stand it. I've stood it for years. You know I have. The comments, the looks, the little cuts. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I'd be the bigger person. I'd smile and I'd be gracious, and one day she'd run out of things to say." She shook her head slowly. "But it was the part about taking up less space, Ren. That's the part that." She pressed her hand flat to her chest, like it physically hurt there. "Because that's what I've been doing," she whispered. "For 9 years, making myself smaller, quieter, folding myself up so I don't bother anyone, so I don't take up too much room, so I don't remind anyone that I wasn't born to this. I've been disappearing by inches for 9 years, and she said it like it was a thing I hadn't done enough. And there it was, the real wound. Not the insult about the dead first queen. Not even the cruelty in front of the cameras. It was that Margaret had named the exact thing Sierra had been doing to herself, quietly for years, and called it a favor she still owed. That's the cruelest kind of cruelty, I've come to think. Not the kind that tells you a lie about yourself. The kind that takes your most secret fear and says it out loud and tells you you're right. She started to cry then. Not loudly. I told you at the start, the worst grief is almost silent, and this was. Her shoulders started to shake and her breath came in these small broken catches, and the tears just ran, ruining all that careful work, ruining the armor. She pressed both hands over her mouth to keep the sound in, because even then, even broken on a bench in a back corridor, some part of her was still standing guard, still terrified someone would hear, still performing for an audience that wasn't there. "I'm sorry," she kept saying through her hands. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't." "You don't have anything to be sorry for, ma'am," I said. "There are 300 people," she said. "I have to go back in. I have to go back in and smile and stand on that balcony, and I can't. I can't do it, not tonight. I can't make my face do it." And that was the most frightening thing she said, because I believed her. I'd seen her hold together through everything. Through hostile crowds and brutal headlines and years of Margareth's slow poison. She'd always been able to make her face do it. And now, for the first time, she was telling me she couldn't, and I believed her completely. "I want to stop here for a second and tell you something about that palace. People think a place like Calderwood is full of people, full of help, full of someone always around to catch you when you fall. And in one sense it is. There are hundreds of staff. There's always someone polishing something or carrying something somewhere. But in another sense, it is the loneliest place I've ever known. Because everyone there has a job, and the job is the surface. The job is the smile, the bow, the yes ma'am, no ma'am. The whole machine of the place runs on everyone pretending that everything is exactly as it appears. And so the people who live at the very center of it, the family, are surrounded by hundreds of people and almost completely alone. There's no one to fall apart in front of. No one safe. Because anyone might talk. Anyone might sell the story. Anyone might let it slip to the wrong person. And then it's in the papers, and then it's everywhere forever. Sierra understood that better than anyone. She'd had 9 years of learning it the hard way. Which is why, I think, what happened next mattered so much. Because for 9 years she'd had nowhere to put it down. And now, in a back corridor, with the rain coming down and the music playing, she was finally putting it down. And the only witness was a dresser named Wren, who had never once given her a reason not to trust. I did the only thing I could think of. I reached over and I took one of her hands. Gently. The way you'd take the hand of a child who'd had a fright. Her hand was cold and it was still trembling, and she gripped mine back so hard it hurt, and I let her, because if my hand hurting could keep her from drowning, then she could hold it as hard as she liked. "Listen to me, ma'am," I said. My voice was shaking a bit too. "You don't have to go back in this second. The world won't end. We'll say you needed a moment with your dress. I'll say there was a problem with the hem. I've got the kit right here. No one will question it. You take all the time you need. There's no rush. There's no one back here but us." She looked at me, and something in her face, I don't know how to describe it except to say that some of the terror went out of it. Not all, but some. Like she'd been holding her breath underwater for 9 years, and someone had just told her she was allowed to come up. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked, and she meant it. She genuinely didn't understand it. That's what years of that place does to a person. It makes plain kindness so rare that when it comes, you can't account for it. "Because you've always been kind to me," I said. "You learned my name, you asked after my dad, you never once made me feel small." I squeezed her hand. "And you don't take up too much space, ma'am." Whatever she said, you don't take up too much. If anything, you've spent too long trying to disappear, and the rest of us would have liked to see more of you, not less. I don't know where the words came from. They weren't clever, but they were true, and I think she could hear that they were true, and sometimes that's the only thing that helps. She cried harder for a moment, but it was different now. It was the kind of crying that lets something out instead of the kind that holds it in, and I just sat with her, holding her cold, shaking hand while it ran its course. The clock tower chimed again, 11:45. She'd quieted some. She'd let go of my hand and was sitting up straighter, taking long, slow breaths, the way you do when the worst of the storm has passed but you're not steady yet. I'd given her the soft cloth from my kit, and she was pressing it under her eyes, careful, trying to save what she could of her face. "I've made a mess of it," she said, a little wetly, looking down at the cloth smudged dark with all that careful makeup. "It's mostly held," I lied, "and anything that hasn't I can sort. Give me 2 minutes and you'll look like nothing ever happened." She gave me a small, watery, grateful smile. "You're a good person, Wren." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and started rummaging in my kit for the little things I kept for exactly this: a powder, a tiny brush, a spare of the color she used. You learn in my job to keep spares of everything. People fall apart at galas more often than you'd think, just usually not this thoroughly. I was just reaching up to dab under her eye when the door at the far end of the corridor opened. I felt Sierra go rigid beside me. Both of us froze, because if it was the wrong person, if it was Margaret or one of her aides or anyone who'd carry the story, then everything we'd just done to put her back together would be for nothing. Worse than nothing. Footsteps quick, coming down the corridor toward us. And then a voice said, "Sierra." It was Henrik. I'd seen the Crown Prince 1,000 times by then. From a distance mostly. Up close at fittings and the like, but always in his careful public skin. The reserved man, the one the papers called cold, the one who gave nothing away. The man who came down that corridor was not that man. He'd clearly come looking for her. I found out afterward that he'd noticed she'd slipped out, that across that whole crowded ballroom, in the middle of 300 guests, he'd been watching her closely enough to see the moment she broke and went. He'd made some excuse and come after her. He'd walked the corridors until he found her. And when he saw her sitting on that battered old bench with her makeup ruined and her eyes red, and the soft cloth still clutched in her hand, his whole face changed. The carefulness fell right off it. What was underneath was raw and frightened and furious all at once. "Sierra," he said again, and crossed the last few feet in a rush and dropped down onto one knee in front of the bench so they were level, so he was looking up into her face. He took both her hands in both of his. "What happened? Tell me what happened. Are you hurt? Are you?" "I'm all right," she started, the old reflex, the armor going back up. "Henrik, I'm fine, I just—" "Don't," he said, quietly, but it stopped her cold. "Don't tell me you're fine, please, not to me, not anymore." And the way he said it, "not anymore," told me this wasn't the first time. That he'd watched her say "I'm fine" 100 times when she wasn't. That he'd let it go 100 times because that was how it worked, that was the deal, you keep the surface smooth. And that something in him had decided, right then in that corridor, that he wasn't going to let it go anymore. I should have left. I knew I should have left. This was nothing I had any business seeing. I started to get up, to slip away, to make myself the invisible furniture I was supposed to be. But Sierra caught my wrist. "Stay," she said, "just that, stay." And Henrik glanced up at me, this stranger kneeling on the floor of a back corridor, and I braced myself to be sent away, and instead he just nodded. A small nod, like, "She trusts you, so I trust you." Like he understood that whatever had happened back here, I'd been the one to hold the cup steady, and that counted for something. So I stayed. I pressed myself back against the wall, and I made myself small, and I stayed, because she'd asked me to. "It was Margaret," Sierra said, and then she told him. All of it. The photograph, the place near the king, the leaning in, the smile. And then the words, the same words she'd said to me. The part about a real queen, the part about marrying down, the part about taking up less space. I watched Henrik's face while she said it. I'd never seen a man go so still. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make a sound. But by the time she got to the end, by the time she said the word space, in that small, flat, ruined voice, his jaw was set so hard I could see the muscle jumping in it, and his hands had tightened around hers, and there was something in his eyes that I can only describe as a kind of cold fire. The careful prince was gone completely. What was left was just a man who'd heard exactly what had been done to the person he loved, and was deciding, in real time, that it would not happen again. "She said that to you," he said, very quietly, "in front of the cameras tonight. Henrik, please don't make it a thing, it'll only—" "She said that to you," he said again, "and you came back here alone to fall apart where no one could see because you didn't think you were allowed to be upset about it." His voice was steady, but there was something terrible under it. "How long, Sierra? How long has this been happening? the truth. And Sira, who had spent 9 years saying I'm fine, who had spent 9 years making herself smaller, looked at her husband kneeling on the floor in front of her, and she ran out of fine. She just ran out of it. "Since the day I got here," she whispered. The corridor was so quiet I could hear the candles guttering. I could hear the rain. I could hear, faint and far away through the wall, the orchestra playing its pretty cruel music to 300 people who had no idea that anything in the world was wrong. Henrik closed his eyes for a second, just 1 second, and when he opened them he let go of her hands and instead, slowly, he reached up and gathered her in. He pulled her down off that bench and into his arms, right there on the floor of the corridor, and he held her. Not the careful, public hand-on-the-elbow kind of touch you see in the photographs. He held her, the way you hold someone who's been carrying something too heavy for too long, the way you hold someone when you're trying to take some of the weight onto your own body through sheer will. One hand on the back of her head, his face pressed into her hair. And she folded into him completely, the last of the armor gone, and she cried. And this time she didn't try to keep it quiet, because for the first time in 9 years she didn't have to. I stood pressed against the wall with my little kit of needles and pins, and I watched a future king kneel on a dusty floor and hold his weeping wife. And I have never, before or since, seen two people more honestly together than they were in that moment. And I thought, this is the family photograph. This, not the one with everyone lined up and smiling, this one, the one nobody will ever see. The clock tower began to chime midnight. And as it chimed, I heard Henrik murmur something into Sira's hair, too low for me to catch most of it, but I caught the end. I caught him saying, very softly, very steadily, like a promise, "This ends tonight, do you hear me? This ends tonight." I've thought a lot over the years about that phrase, "this ends tonight." When you hear a man say it like that, quiet, steady, into the hair of the woman he loves, your mind goes to dramatic places. You imagine a door flung open, a shouting match, Margaret's face when she's finally called to account in front of everyone. That's the version a person wants, isn't it? The clean one. The one where the cruel get what's coming to them and the whole ballroom gasps. That isn't what happened. I'll tell you what happened, because the truth is better, even if it's quieter. For a while longer, nothing happened at all. Henrik just held her. He held her until the worst of the shaking stopped, until her breathing came back to something even. He didn't rush her and he didn't say much. Just every now and then, "Lo, I've got you and I'm here and take your time." Simple things. The things you'd say to anyone you loved who was breaking. It struck me, watching, that this was a man who was usually so careful with his words in public. And here in private, he'd found the only words that mattered, and he just said them, over and over, like he was building a floor under her. When she finally pulled back, her face was a ruin and her eyes were swollen, and she looked utterly spent, but she looked lighter somehow. Like something that had been sitting on her chest for 9 years had been lifted off, even if only for the moment. "I'm sorry," she said again automatically. "Stop," Henrik said, but gently now. He reached up and wiped her cheek with his thumb, that same small gesture I'd seen him do at a dinner once years before, a crumb on her cheek, the two of them laughing, except now it was tears and nobody was laughing. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You've never had anything to be sorry for. That's the part I can't." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I've let you carry this alone for too long. I told myself it was easier not to make waves. That was cowardice, and it was you who paid for it. That's mine, I'm sorry." She stared at him. I don't think anyone in that family had said "that's mine, I'm sorry" to her in 9 years. They didn't, those people. Apologizing wasn't in the architecture of the place. And to hear it from him, kneeling on a dusty floor, I watched it land on her like warmth on someone who'd been cold so long they'd forgotten there was anything else. Then Henrik stood, he helped her up off the bench, and he turned to me. "Ren," he said, and I startled because I hadn't expected him to use my name. He'd been told it once, I supposed, by Sira in the middle of everything. He'd remembered it. "Can you make her ready, whatever you need? Take as long as it takes." And then he looked at Sira. I'd like you to come back in with me on my arm to the balcony with everyone watching. Sira went pale. Henrik, I can't, my face. Everyone will see I've been. Let them see, he said. And there was something in the way he said it, not careless. He wasn't asking her to walk out there as a wreck. That's what I did, that's where my needles and pins finally came in useful. But what he meant, I understood later, was deeper than makeup. He meant, you don't have to hide anymore. Whatever's left on your face when Ren's done, you walk out there beside me and you let them see a real person, and if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. So I went to work. 2 minutes I'd promised her earlier, and I made good on it. Powder, the little brush, the spare color, a careful hand. I cooled the swelling under her eyes with the back of a chilled silver spoon. I sent a passing footman to fetch. You learn these tricks. I fixed a pin that had come loose from her hair. By the time I stepped back, she looked not flawless. I'll be honest. You could still see, if you knew her, that something had happened. Her eyes were a little too bright. There was a fragility to her. But she looked real. And she looked, somehow, more herself than she had at the start of the night, in all that careful armor. There, I said, you look like a queen, ma'am. And this time she didn't make the joke about Margaret. She just looked at me in the little hand mirror, and her chin came up, and something steadied in her face. Thank you, Ren, she said, for all of it. Henrik offered her his arm. She took it. And the two of them walked back down the corridor toward the ballroom, toward the music and the light and the 300 people, and just before they reached the door, Sira glanced back at me one more time and she smiled. A small, fierce, frightened, true smile. Then the door opened, the music swelled out to meet them, and they were gone. Now, I told you I'd tell you what this ends tonight actually meant. Here it is. And I only know it because of where I was standing, which was, once again, in the wrong place at the right time. After they'd gone in, I had to gather my kit and go back through a different door to the staff side. The route took me past the small antechamber off the main ballroom, a kind of holding room where the family waited before they made their entrances. The door was open a crack, and as I passed, I heard voices, and I am ashamed to say I stopped. I'm not ashamed enough not to tell you what I heard. It was Henrik and Margaret. He'd left Sira safely out among the guests. I gathered and pulled Margaret aside, and he was speaking to her in a voice I'd never heard him use. Not loud. That's the thing. He'd learned the same lesson she had, that the most dangerous words are the quiet ones. But where her quiet was a knife, his was something else. His was the quiet of a man who has made up his mind. I'm only going to say this once, he was saying, so I'd ask you to listen carefully. A pause. I imagine Margaret drew herself up. I imagine she had that smile ready. Henrik, dear, I don't know what she's told you, but you know how sensitive she. I know exactly what you said to her, Henrik said. Word for word. About a real queen, about marrying down, about taking up less space. Another pause. I want you to understand that I heard those words from her with her makeup running down her face, hiding in a back corridor, apologizing for being upset. For 9 years she has come into this family and tried, every single day, to earn a welcome she should never have had to earn. And for 9 years, you have made it your work to convince her she's a stain on this house. I have done no such. You'll let me finish. And she did. That's how I knew the ground had shifted, because Margaret was a woman who never let anyone finish, and now she was quiet. Here is what's going to happen. You're going to stop. Tonight, not soften it, not be more careful about who's listening. Stop. Every comment, every look, every clever little remark, it's over. Because the next time it happens, and I'll always know now, I'm watching for it from this night on. The next time, I take it to my father. Tonight, while he's still well enough to act on it. And I tell him everything. 9 years of it. And we'll see whose place in this family is secure. A long silence. You wouldn't, Margaret said, but her voice had lost something. Try me, Henrik said. You've spent years telling Sira she doesn't belong here. Be very careful, Margaret. Of the two of you, she is the one this country is coming to love. You should think hard about which of you is really standing somewhere she hasn't earned. I heard footsteps then, and I fled, properly fled, down the staff corridor with my kit banging against my hip, because the last thing I needed was to be caught eavesdropping on the crown prince threatening the king's wife. But I'd heard enough. This ends tonight. That's what it meant. Not a scene in front of 300 people, a quiet word in an antechamber, a line drawn, finally, by the one person with the standing to draw it, who'd spent 9 years failing to draw it and had decided on a rainy night in March that he was done failing. There was the balcony after. I watched it from a window 2 floors up, with a couple of the other staff, the way we always did. Midnight had passed. It was the last great moment of the gala, the whole family stepping out onto the great stone balcony above the courtyard, where a crowd had gathered in the drizzle, hundreds of them, umbrellas and raincoats and faces turned up, waiting. They came out in their order. The king, slow, leaning on his cane but smiling and lifting a hand. Margaret at his side, and I'll tell you, even from 2 floors up, even in the dark, I could see something had gone out of her. She stood a half step back. She didn't have that look she always had, the one that said the room belonged to her. She looked, for the first time I'd ever seen, like a guest in her own house. And then Henrik, and on his arm Sira. The crowd's noise changed when she came out. I heard it even from up high, a kind of warm swell, the sound a crowd makes when it sees the person it actually came for. And Sira, who had spent 9 years folding herself smaller, disappearing by inches, standing at the edges so as not to take up too much room. Sira stepped forward, to the front of the balcony, right up to the stone rail into the light where everyone could see her. She didn't shrink. She didn't hang back. She stood up straight and she lifted her hand and she gave that crowd the fullest, realest smile I'd seen on her in all my years there, and the crowd roared back at her, and the rain came down, and the courtyard lamps lit up all those upturned faces. And she just stood there, taking up space, exactly as much as she pleased. I had to turn away from the window for a second. I won't pretend I didn't. Henrik stood beside her, and he was looking out at the crowd, but his hand had found the small of her back steady there, and every now and then he'd glance over at her, not for the cameras, just for himself, just to look at her. And the look on his face was the look of a man whose whole world is standing right next to him, finally, where everyone can see, not taking up less space but taking up all of it, and good. Good. That was the photograph the next morning. That one. Sira at the front of the balcony, lit up, radiant, mid-laugh, the rain like silver in the lamplight, Henrik beside her with his hand at her back and his eyes on her instead of the crowd. It ran on the front of every paper in the kingdom. A family united, the headlines said, or words like it. The whole country looked at that picture and saw a perfect royal moment. And only a handful of people in the world knew what it had cost to make it. Knew that an hour before, the woman in that picture had been on the floor of a back corridor, broken, apologizing for the crime of being hurt. Knew that the radiance wasn't the armor finally perfected. It was the armor finally gone. I knew I was one of the handful. That's why I've kept it all these years, I think. Not because it was a secret I was paid to keep, because it was a thing too precious and too private to spend. I should tell you how it went after. It got better, truly. Not overnight and not perfectly. These things don't work like a story, with a clean line drawn and everyone changed forever by morning. But the weather inside Calderwood shifted, and it shifted that night. Margaret stopped. Whether it was the threat of the king, or whether some small thing in her had been reached, I couldn't tell you. But the comments dried up. The little cuts stopped coming. At dinners I'd watch the two of them now, Margaret and Sira, and there was a coolness there, always, that never healed, I won't lie to you, but there was a wide and careful distance, and in that distance Sira could finally breathe. And Sira changed. That's the part I loved to watch in the years I had left there. She stopped folding herself up, bit by bit. She started saying what she thought in meetings. She started choosing the brighter dress instead of the safer one. She took on causes of her own and she fought for them, properly fought, and the country, which had been learning to love her, fell the rest of the way. By the time I retired, you couldn't have found a person in all of Aldermere who'd have said she didn't belong. The girl from the coastal town, the one who married up or down or however you want to put it, none of it mattered anymore. She was theirs. She'd taken up her space and they'd given it to her gladly. The old king died a few years later peacefully in his sleep, in the room with the library he loved. And in time Henrik became king and Sira became queen, a real one, whatever Margaret had meant by that word. And from everything I've heard since I left, she's a good one. The kind people will tell stories about long after she's gone. The kind they'll compare the next one to, which is its own quiet justice when you think about where she started. As for me, I left Calderwood after 19 years. Got older, got slower. The new dressers were younger and quicker. There's always a new wren darting into rooms before anyone knows she's coming. I went home, more or less, to the town 3 hours north where nothing happens. My father's gone now too. I've got a little garden. I grow roses, which my husband finds funny, given I spent 19 years smelling them at every gala and swore I never wanted to see another one. But I keep them anyway, white ones and cream and pale gold. Because every spring when they come in, and the whole garden goes thick with that smell, and the beeswax I still use on the old kitchen table, the two of them together, I'm right back in that corridor. The rain on the windows, the orchestra through the wall, a woman in a midnight blue dress with her hands shaking, telling the floor that she'd been disappearing for 9 years and that someone had told her it wasn't enough. And a man on his knees holding her, telling her it ends tonight. People think the royal life is the balconies and the crowns and the photographs, the grand, lit-up moments everyone gets to see, and those are real, I suppose. But I was there for the other kind, the corridor kind, the kind with no cameras, and I'll tell you what I learned in 19 years of standing in the corners of that palace, watching the most watched people in the kingdom when they thought no one was looking. The cruelest people are almost always the most frightened, and the strongest person in any room is usually the one who's been quietly holding everything together for so long that nobody's noticed she's about to break. So look closer, at the ones who are always fine, at the ones who never take up space. Sometimes the bravest thing a person ever does isn't done on a balcony, in front of a roaring crowd. Sometimes it's done on a dusty floor, in a back corridor, when they finally stop saying I'm fine, and let someone hold them instead.